Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. November brings us deeper into the darkness, and for this special episode, I've gathered 7 true horror stories from the Appalachian Trail that will haunt you long after you finish watching. These aren't campfire tale, these are real experiences from real people who encountered something unexplainable in the mountains. But before we dive into the terror, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share this with your friends. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all for being here. Now, let's begin. I'm 34 years old and work as a park ranger for the Georgia state system. Been doing it for about 8 years now, mostly because I love being outdoors and, honestly, the pay's decent enough to keep a small apartment in Dahlonega. I've always been the type who prefers trees to people, which makes this job perfect for me most days. My beat covers about 40 miles of the Appalachian Trail through North Georgia, plus some of the more remote day hiking areas that don't get much foot traffic. But I need to tell you about something I found last November. Something that's been eating at me for months now, and I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I've never told anyone the whole truth about what happened to Kevin Park, and after what I discovered last week, I think I understand why I kept quiet. Some part of me always knew that talking about it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Last November, I was doing my regular end-of-season patrol before the trail officially closed for winter maintenance. It's usually pretty routine stuff, checking shelters for damage, clearing fallen branches, making sure the trail markers are still visible. Most through hikers have already finished their journeys by then, so I don't expect to run into many people. The weather had been mild that week, unseasonably warm for late November, which meant a few stragglers might still be trying to finish their sections before the snow started. I grew up about 30 minutes from where I work now, in a little town called Cleveland that most people have never heard of. My dad worked in the poultry plants until his back gave out, and my mom cleaned houses for some of the wealthier folks who had vacation cabins up in the mountains. We weren't poor exactly, but we weren't rich either. I spent most of my childhood roaming around these same mountains, which is probably why I never get that spooked feeling that some people talk about when they're alone in the woods. At least, I never used to. The mountains have always felt like home to me, until that day in November when I realized they might be home to things I'd never imagined. The trail section I was patrolling that day runs through some pretty remote territory. It's about a 6-mile stretch between 2 road crossings, with one shelter right in the middle. The terrain gets pretty rocky through there, and the trail winds around some old-growth areas that have never been logged. There are a few spots where you can still see the remnants of old homesteads from the 1800s, stone foundations, rusted farm equipment, that sort of thing. The Forest Service keeps most of it cleared back from the trail, but if you know where to look, you can find all kinds of historical stuff scattered through those woods. My grandmother used to tell stories about that particular stretch of mountains. She said her great-grandmother remembered when the Cherokee were still living there, before the removal. But she also told stranger stories about people who went into those mountains and came back different, or didn't come back at all. I always figured it was just the kind of folklore that accumulates around old places, stories told to keep children from wandering too far from home. I started my patrol around 9 that morning, planning to cover the whole section and be back to my truck by mid-afternoon. The first few miles went exactly like I expected. I cleared a couple of small branches that had fallen across the trail, checked the condition of a wooden bridge that crosses a creek, and made notes about which trail markers needed fresh paint come spring. The shelter was in good shape, though someone had left behind a few empty beer cans that I packed out with me. It was around mile 4 that I found Kevin's backpack. At first, I thought maybe someone had just stopped for a break and wandered off the trail to use the bathroom or something. The pack was sitting right in the middle of the trail, perfectly upright, like someone had just set it down carefully and walked away. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong with the whole scene. The pack wasn't just sitting there, it was positioned with geometric precision, facing exactly north according to my compass. All the straps were arranged in perfect symmetry, creating a pattern that looked almost deliberate. I waited around for about 15 minutes, calling out to see if anyone would respond. The silence that came back wasn't normal mountain quiet. It was the kind of silence you get when every living thing in the area has decided to hold its breath. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, Even my own voice seemed to disappear into the air without creating an echo. When nobody showed up, I started to get concerned. It's not normal for someone to just abandon their gear like that, especially not a pack that probably cost more than I make in a week. I checked the outside pockets to see if there was any identification, thinking maybe someone had gotten hurt and I'd need to call for help. That's when I found the journal. It was in the top pocket of the pack, along with a wallet containing a Georgia driver's license for Kevin Park, age 26, from Atlanta. The license photo showed a normal-looking guy with brown hair and a friendly smile, the kind of person you'd trust to watch your house while you were out of town. According to the journal's first entry, he was attempting his first solo section hike, planning to cover about 50 miles over 5 days. Everything seemed legitimate. His gear was high quality but not brand new, the kind of stuff someone would accumulate over time as they got more serious about hiking. But as I flipped through the journal pages, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The handwriting deteriorated dramatically over just 5 days. But it wasn't just getting sloppier. It was changing in ways that didn't make sense. The letters were becoming elongated and angular, like someone was trying to write with fingers that were the wrong shape for holding a pen. I sat down on a fallen log and read the whole thing. November 19th, day 1 solo hiking. Feeling great. Weather perfect. Making good time. Left Neal's Gap this morning around 7 a.m., planning to hit Woody Gap by Thursday. Trail conditions are excellent, much better than I expected for this time of year. Camped at Whitley Gap Shelter tonight, met an interesting old-timer named Earl who's been hiking these mountains for over 40 years. Guy knows everything about this area, showed me on his map where to find the best water sources and which campsites to avoid. Really nice to meet someone with so much experience. Earl invited me to see some real mountain secrets tomorrow. Says there's a hidden cave system about a mile off the main trail with Native American rock art that most people never get to see. Sounds incredible, definitely taking him up on the offer. November 20th, followed Earl off-trail this morning to the cave system he mentioned. The entrance was hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but Earl knew exactly how to move the stones to reveal the opening. Incredible rock formations inside. Some of the chambers go back further than my headlamp can reach. The Native American paintings are amazing, but Earl says some of them are much older than Cherokee. He showed me symbols that his family has been protecting for generations, marking the places where the mountain chooses to change people. While I was examining some of the artwork in a side chamber, Earl disappeared. Called out for him but no answer. Found even deeper chambers that I hadn't noticed before, walls covered in symbols that looked freshly carved. These new symbols were disturbing. Human figures transforming into something with longer limbs, extended necks, hands that ended in points. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had tried to draw people, but had forgotten what people actually look like. Getting dark outside, and I realized I'd lost track of time down here. Decided to camp at the cave entrance for the night since I'm not familiar with the route back to the main trail in the dark. Earl will probably be back in the morning. Hope he's okay. November 21st. Woke up feeling strange. My hands look different somehow. The fingers seem longer, the nails harder and sharper. Must be dehydration, or maybe some kind of mineral deficiency from the cave water I drank yesterday. Actually feel stronger though, more energetic than I have in months. My vision seems sharper too, like I can see details in the shadows that I never noticed before. Earl returned around midday with others. A woman named Sarah, who said she used to work in Charlotte before she found this place, and a man called David who claimed he'd been here since 1987. They all moved strangely, with too much grace for the rocky terrain. Earl says this cave is a changing chamber that helps people adapt to true mountain life. Says modern civilization makes humans weak and incomplete, but that this place can restore us to what we're supposed to be. Sarah showed me her hands. The same elongated fingers I'm developing, but much more pronounced. Says it takes about a week for the full transformation. Earl says I'm special, that the mountain accepts me faster than most visitors. He's lived here for decades, along with others who have learned to become proper mountain dwellers. November 22nd. The changes are accelerating. I can see in complete darkness now. Every detail of these cave chambers is clear as daylight. The rock formations seem to pulse with their own rhythm, like they're alive. Hearing sounds from miles away. Individual animals moving through the forest, their heartbeats, their breathing patterns. can smell each person who has passed through these mountains in recent weeks. Their fear, their excitement, their sweat. Earl explains that I'm becoming a proper mountain dweller, a superior version of what humans are supposed to be. My old body was weak and limited, designed for concrete and artificial light, but this new form is perfect for wilderness life. Can't remember why I ever wanted to leave these mountains. The city life seems foreign now, like a memory from someone else's existence. Earl's family has been here since before the Cherokee, he says. They were changed by something older than human memory, something that lives in the deepest parts of the mountain. Now they maintain the balance, ensuring the mountain gets what it needs to grow stronger. Every year, a few people are chosen. Every year, a few people become something better. November 23rd. This will be my last entry as Kevin. Tomorrow, I join Earl's mountain family permanently. My new brothers and sisters have been here for decades, all perfectly adapted to this environment. We hunt together, think together, protect the mountains from unsuitable humans, while selecting the worthy ones for transformation. The cave gives us everything we need: enhanced bodies, shared consciousness, perfect unity with the ancient intelligence that shapes these mountains. Kevin's old life seems like a dream now, a pale shadow of what existence is supposed to be. The mountain chooses carefully, Earl explained. Not everyone can handle the change. Some break during transformation and have to be recycled back into the mountain's substance. But I'm strong enough. I can feel the mountain approving of what I'm becoming. This is what I was meant to become. The handwriting of that last entry was completely different from the earlier ones. The letters were elongated and angular, with some characters I didn't recognize mixed in with normal English words. There was one more entry, written in yet another hand entirely. We thank Kevin for his offering of weak flesh. His essence joins our collective, his adaptation serves the mountain's purpose. The changing chambers hunger for new material as tourist season approaches. We leave this journal as invitation for worthy candidates. Those who read and understand the mountain's call may find us in the deep chambers where the old symbols wait to remake the willing. The circle grows stronger with each edition. I sat there for a long time after I finished reading, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an elaborate prank, but the journal felt genuinely old and weathered. More disturbing was the fact that I recognized some of the names mentioned in the entries. 3 years ago, we'd had a missing person case involving a woman from Charlotte who disappeared while hiking alone. Her name was Sarah Hendricks. The official report said she'd probably fallen into one of the gorges, and her body had been washed away by spring floods. I checked Kevin's wallet again. Everything looked legitimate: credit cards, membership cards for an Atlanta gym, a business card from the auto repair shop where he apparently worked. There was even a photo of him with a young woman, both of them smiling at the camera in what looked like a casual restaurant setting. But there were things that didn't make sense. For one, the pack was way too clean. After 4 days on the trail, especially including time spent exploring caves, everything should have been dirty and worn. Instead, it looked like it had just been carefully cleaned and organized. All the zippers were closed, all the straps were properly secured, and even the water bottles were filled with water that tasted strange, metallic, with an earthy aftertaste that lingered in my mouth. More unsettling was the fact that I couldn't find any trail of footprints or disturbed vegetation leading away from where the pack had been left. The trail surface was soft from recent rain, and there should have been clear signs of someone walking away from that spot in any direction. But the area around the pack looked undisturbed, like it had just materialized there. I spent another hour searching the immediate area, calling Kevin's name and looking for any signs of where he might have gone. But the longer I stayed there, the more wrong everything felt. The silence was becoming oppressive, and I started to notice that the shadows weren't falling the way they should. According to my watch, it was just past noon, but the shadows were long and dark, pointing in directions that didn't match the sun's position. Finally, I made the decision to hike back to my truck and call it in to the authorities. I took the journal with me as evidence, but left the pack where I found it so the police could document the scene properly. The hike back felt different somehow, longer than it should have been, and I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. Several times I heard what sounded like footsteps matching my pace, but when I stopped to listen, the sounds would stop too. About a mile from where I'd found the pack, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Just off the trail, hidden behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes, was a perfect circle of stones. Each stone was about the size of a football, and they were arranged with geometric precision. In the center of the circle, someone had placed a collection of hiking gear: boots, water bottles, pieces of camping equipment, even some clothing items. But the disturbing part wasn't the gear itself. It was how old some of it looked. Some of the boots were styles I remembered from the 1980 seconds. A few of the water bottles were brands that hadn't been manufactured in decades. But mixed in with the old gear were newer items: a modern GPS unit, a smartphone in a waterproof case, a headlamp that couldn't be more than a few years old. It was like someone had been adding to this collection for a very long time, and they were still adding to it. I didn't stick around to examine the items closely. Something about that place felt wrong in a way I can't really explain. The air was too still, too quiet. Even though it was the middle of the day, the shadows inside that circle seemed darker than they should have been, and they seemed to move independently of the tree branches above them. The police investigation lasted about 3 weeks. They brought in search and rescue teams, used helicopters to scan the area, and even brought in some dogs to try to pick up Kevin's scent. They found nothing. No trace of where he might have gone, no evidence of foul play, no indication that he'd been injured or had gotten lost. The case was eventually classified as a missing person investigation, but with no leads to follow up on. I never told the investigators about the journal entries that mentioned the cave system or the transformation process described in Kevin's writing. I told myself it was because I knew how crazy it would sound, but looking back now, I think some part of me was afraid they'd actually find something if they started looking for caves in that area. I also didn't mention the stone circle I'd discovered, though I'm not sure why. Maybe because I knew that if they found it, they'd want to catalog all those items, and some of them might match up with other missing person cases. But I kept thinking about those journal entries, especially the changes in handwriting and the descriptions of physical transformation. I started researching missing person cases in our area, going back decades. What I found disturbed me more than I expected. Over the past 40 years, we'd had 17 unexplained disappearances along that particular section of trail. All of them were solo hikers, all experienced outdoors, people who shouldn't have gotten lost or injured. The disappearances followed a pattern. They always happened in late fall or early winter, always in the same general area, and the few times we'd found abandoned gear, it had always been arranged too neatly, too purposefully. A few weeks after the investigation ended, I went back to that section of trail during my regular patrol. I told myself I was just doing my job, checking on the area where the incident had occurred. But really, I was looking for answers. The spot where I found Kevin's pack looked completely normal. There was no indication that anything unusual had ever happened there. I spent some time walking through the woods on either side of the trail, looking for anything that might resemble the cave system described in the journal. What I found was worse than I expected. About half a mile off the main trail, following what looked like an old game path, I discovered not one but 3 stone circles. Each one was perfectly constructed, and each one contained a different type of collection. The first circle held camping gear, just like the one I'd found before. The second contained personal items, wallets, jewelry, photographs, even a few driver's licenses that I recognized from old missing person reports. The third circle was the one that made me understand I was dealing with something far beyond a simple missing person case. This circle contained bones, not scattered randomly, but arranged in careful patterns. Human bones, sorted by type, all the femurs in one pile, all the ribs in another, skulls arranged in a neat row around the perimeter. The bones were clean, bleached white by weather and time, but some of them still had scraps of clothing attached. I counted 17 skulls, 17 missing hikers over 40 years. 17 stone circles waiting to be discovered. But the most disturbing part was what I found in the center of the bone circle. A journal, newer than Kevin's, but written in that same elongated, angular handwriting I'd seen in his final entries. This journal contained entries from multiple people, different names and dates spanning several years. All of them described the same process: meeting Earl, being led to caves, undergoing some kind of transformation, and eventually joining what they called the Mountains family. The final entry in this journal was dated just 2 weeks before I found it. The The circle grows stronger with each addition. Kevin has adapted well to his new form. His elongation process completed successfully, consciousness fully integrated with collective. November hunting season begins soon. New candidates already identified among seasonal hikers. The mountain's appetite grows with each feeding cycle. We have prepared 17 collection points for the approaching season. Those who read these words are invited to join us willingly or will be harvested according to the mountain's judgment. I ran. I don't remember much about the hike back to my truck, but I know I ran most of the way. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed deliberate. I kept expecting to see Earl and his family emerging from the tree line, ready to add me to their collection. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for an hour trying to decide what to do. I could call the police and try to explain about the circles and the bones, but I knew how insane it would sound. And part of me was afraid that if I led them back there, we might not find anything. Or worse, we might find something that would make the situation even more dangerous. Instead, I made a different decision. I drove home, packed a bag, and took a 2-week vacation to visit my sister in Florida. I needed time to think, and I needed to be far away from those mountains while I figured out what to do next. When I came back, I returned to the stone circles with a different plan. Over the course of several trips, I dismantled them. I scattered the bones deep in the woods, buried the camping gear, and broke apart the stone arrangements. If there really was something supernatural happening in those mountains, maybe disrupting their carefully constructed patterns would interfere with whatever process they were using. For months, everything seemed normal. No more missing hikers, no more strange incidents, no more abandoned packs arranged with geometric precision. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd solved the problem, that whatever had been happening was over. That was until last week. I was doing my regular patrol of the same section, the first one since the snow melted. Everything seemed normal for the first few miles. But when I reached the spot where I'd found Kevin's pack, I discovered something that made my hands shake so badly I could barely write my incident report. Someone had rebuilt the circles. All 3 of them, in exactly the same locations where I'd found them before. The stones were arranged in identical patterns, and the collections had been restored. Not just restored, expanded. There were new items in each circle, gear I didn't recognize from any of the missing person cases I'd researched. And in the center of the camping gear circle, there was a new journal. The first entry was dated 3 days ago. The circle rebuilds itself. The mountain remembers every stone, every arrangement, every purpose. Those who disturb the sacred patterns only delay the inevitable harvest. The winter feeding was successful despite interference. 7 new additions to the collective, including a park ranger who thought he could hide from the mountain's judgment by traveling south. Distance means nothing to the mountain's reach. Willingness is preferred but not required. Spring hunting season begins now. The April hikers arrive soon, young and strong and perfect for transformation. New candidates already selected from trail registration records. The collection points have been restored to full power. To the ranger who reads this, you cannot destroy what the mountain builds. You cannot hide from what the mountain chooses. Your interference has been noted and forgiven, but further, disruption will not be tolerated. Join willingly or be processed according to ancient protocols. The circle grows stronger with each addition. The handwriting was Kevin's, but elongated even further than his final journal entries. Some of the words weren't in any language I recognized. I'm writing this at home, 2 days after I found that journal. I've called in sick to work, and I've been trying to figure out what to do next. I could try calling the FBI, but I know they'd never believe me without evidence, and I'm afraid to go back and get evidence. I could try to research the area's history, see if I can find any records of what might have been happening in those mountains before the trail was built. But honestly, I'm starting to think it doesn't matter what I do. Last night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on my bedroom window. When I looked out, there was a figure standing in my yard. It was tall and thin, with proportions that didn't look quite human. In the moonlight, I could see that its fingers were too long, its neck extended in a way that reminded me of the symbols Kevin had described in the cave. It was holding something up to show me. A stone, perfectly round, the right size to start building a new circle. The figure stood there for about 10 minutes, completely motionless except for that rhythmic tapping on the glass. Then it turned and walked away, moving with that same unnatural grace Kevin had described in his journal. I found the stone on my doorstep this morning, along with a note written in that familiar, elongated handwriting. The circle will include you. I'm leaving town today. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't stay here. I'm hoping that if I get far enough away, maybe whatever's happening in those mountains won't be able to follow me. But I keep thinking about that journal entry that mentioned the ranger who tried to hide by traveling south. I keep thinking about how the mountain's reach apparently extends far beyond Georgia. And I keep thinking about the fact that as I'm writing this, I can see that my own handwriting is starting to change. The letters are getting longer, more angular. My fingers feel different when I hold the pen. I think the circle has already included me. If someone finds this account, don't go looking for the stone circles I described. Don't try to investigate Kevin Park's disappearance or any of the other missing hikers from that area. And whatever you do, don't try to hike that section of the Appalachian Trail, especially not alone. The mountain is always watching, the mountain is always choosing, and the circle always grows stronger. I'm 27 years old, and I deliver pizza for Marco's in Roanoke. It's not exactly the career I planned when I got my business degree, but after 3 years of working double shifts and barely scraping by, I'd been looking forward to my first real vacation since I started the job. My beat-up 2006 Honda Civic had been sitting in the parking lot outside my apartment for weeks, practically begging me to take it somewhere other than suburban driveways with porch lights and barking dogs. I'd been saving up tips in a coffee can for months, and I finally had enough for a couple days camping in Shenandoah. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, some granola bars, and whatever peace I could find on the trails. My girlfriend Sarah thought I was crazy for wanting to go alone, but honestly, after dealing with customers all day every day, the idea of not talking to another human being for 48 hours sounded like paradise. The plan was simple: drive up to the Hawksbill Summit trailhead, park in the day you slot, and hike the circuit trail over 2 days with one night camping at the backcountry site. I'd done my research, downloaded the maps, even called the ranger station to make sure I had the right permits. Everything was legal and by the book. I wasn't some inexperienced weekend warrior. I'd been hiking these mountains since I was a kid with my dad, back before he passed. I knew what I was doing. The drive up was perfect. November 18th turned out to be one of those crisp, clear days you only get in late fall. Blue sky, bright sun, temperature in the low 50s. Perfect hiking weather. I'd left Roanoke around noon after my last delivery shift, and I was feeling genuinely excited for the first time in months. The Honda was running better than it had in years, and I'd even splurged on new hiking boots the week before. When I pulled into the parking lot at Hawksbill around 2:45, there were only a few other cars scattered around. Most of the leaf peeper crowds had cleared out by then, and the serious hikers usually started earlier in the day. I parked in space 14. I remember because it was right under this big security camera mounted on a pole. Not that I was thinking about security cameras at the time. I was just focused on getting my gear sorted and hitting the trail before I lost too much daylight. The lot was one of those standard Park Service setups. Gravel surface, wooden posts marking the spaces, a big information board with trail maps and emergency contact numbers. There was a bathroom building on the far end and a couple of those brown metal bear-proof trash cans. Everything looked normal and well-maintained. The kind of place where the most dangerous thing you'd expect to encounter would be a family of raccoons getting into your cooler. I took my time organizing my pack, double-checking that I had everything I needed: water filter, sleeping bag, camp stove, first aid kit, headlamp with extra batteries. I even took a couple selfies by my car. Sarah had made me promise to send photos so she'd know I made it safely. Looking back at those pictures now, I can see how excited I looked, how normal everything seemed. The trailhead was maybe 50 yards from the parking area, marked with the standard wooden sign showing distances and difficulty ratings. I shouldered my pack around 250 and headed toward the tree line. The trail started as a wide, well-maintained path through mixed hardwood forest: oak, maple, hickory, the usual suspects. Most of the leaves had fallen by then, creating this thick carpet that crunched satisfyingly under my new boots. I remember turning back once when I reached the edge of the parking lot and giving a little wave toward that security camera. It seemed like the polite thing to do, like saying goodbye to civilization for a couple days. The guy at the pizza place, Tony, always joked that I was too polite for my own good. "You'd probably apologize to a bear before it mauled you," he used to say. Turns out he wasn't wrong about the politeness thing. The first few hours of hiking were exactly what I'd hoped for. The trail was challenging but not brutal, winding up through dense forest with occasional breaks that offered views back toward the valley. I made good time, stopping every hour or so to drink water and check my progress against the map. The plan was to hike about 6 miles to the backcountry camping area, set up for the night, then complete the loop the next day. By evening, I'd reached the designated camping spot and had my tent set up just as the sun was starting to set behind the ridge. The site was perfect, a small clearing next to a reliable stream, with established fire rings showing that other campers had used the spot before. I cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove, listened to the stream gurgling over the rocks, and felt more relaxed than I had in months. There's something about being alone in the woods that just clears your head, you know? All the stress and noise of daily life just falls away. That first night passed without incident. I slept better than I had in weeks, wrapped up in my sleeping bag with nothing but the sound of water and wind through the trees. I woke up the next morning feeling genuinely refreshed and ready to complete the loop trail back to my car. The morning hike started off normal enough. The weather was still perfect, maybe a little cooler than the day before, but nothing uncomfortable. The trail was clearly marked, and I was making good progress toward the return route that would bring me back to the parking lot by mid-afternoon. It was probably around 11 a.m. when I first noticed something was off. I'd been walking for about 2 hours, following what should have been a straightforward path back toward the trailhead, when I realized I hadn't seen any of the landmarks I remembered from the hike in. The trail markers were still there, and my compass was pointing in the right direction, but something about the landscape felt wrong. The trees looked different somehow. Not different species, still the same oak and maple forest I'd hiked through the day before, but the arrangement felt unfamiliar. I stopped to check my map and GPS, but everything indicated I was exactly where I should be. The trail was heading northeast toward the parking area, just like it was supposed to. I told myself it was probably just because I was seeing the forest from a different angle, hiking in the opposite direction from the day before. When you're tired and focused on the trail in front of your feet, it's easy to miss details about your surroundings. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I was somehow not where I thought I was. Around noon, I stopped for lunch at what should have been a familiar stream crossing. I definitely remembered this spot from the hike in a wooden footbridge over a creek with a small waterfall upstream. But when I sat down to eat my sandwich and check the map again, I realized I couldn't hear any water. That's when I started paying closer attention to the sounds around me. Or rather, the lack of sounds. The forest was completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died to nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire mountain. I stood up from the bridge and walked a few steps upstream to where the waterfall should have been. The creek bed was there, carved into the rock just like I remembered, but it was bone dry. Not just low water from a dry spell, completely dry, with dead leaves scattered across stones that should have been slick with running water. My first thought was that maybe there had been some kind of drought I hadn't heard about, or that the Park Service had diverted the water for some reason. But that didn't explain the total silence. Even in dry conditions, you'd expect to hear birds or squirrels or something. This was the kind of deep, complete quiet that made your ears ring. I decided to pick up the pace and get back to the car as quickly as possible. Something about the silence was making me genuinely uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why. It's not like quiet was unusual in the woods. Some of my best hiking experiences had been in perfectly peaceful forest settings. But this felt different, unnatural. The trail continued to follow the route shown on my map, but I kept noticing small details that seemed wrong. A distinctive boulder that I remembered being on the left side of the path was now on the right. A fallen tree that had blocked part of the trail the day before was nowhere to be seen. Nothing dramatic enough to make me think I was completely lost, but enough little inconsistencies to keep me on edge. By 2 p.m., I should have been getting close to the parking area, but the forest around me looked exactly the same as it had for the past hour. Dense hardwood trees, leaf-covered trail, occasional glimpses of sky through the canopy. No sign of the more open terrain I remembered near the trailhead. I stopped to check my GPS again, and that's when I discovered the first real problem. The device was showing my location, but the trail on the screen didn't match the path I was walking on. According to the GPS, I should have been standing in the middle of empty forest, at least half a mile from any marked trail. I turned the unit off and back on, thinking maybe it was a glitch. The satellites reconnected quickly enough, showing full signal strength, but the reading was the same. As far as my GPS was concerned, I was bushwhacking through unmarked wilderness, not following a well-maintained Park Service trail. That's when I started to feel the first real stirring of panic. I'd been depending on that GPS as backup navigation, and if it wasn't working correctly, I could be in serious trouble. I tried my cell phone, but as expected in the mountains, I had no signal. Not unusual, but not particularly comforting either. I decided to trust my compass and the physical trail markers rather than the electronic navigation. The path was still clearly defined, and the blazes on the trees were exactly what they should be for the route I was following. Technology fails sometimes, especially in areas with heavy tree cover or mineral deposits that can interfere with satellite signals. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest around me began to feel increasingly wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The light seemed dimmer than it should be for mid-afternoon, even accounting for the thick canopy. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, like the pressure you get before a big storm. But the sky I could see through the trees was still clear blue. Around 4 p.m., I started hearing sounds behind me. Not animal sounds, footsteps. Deliberate, measured footsteps that seemed to be following the same trail I was walking. At first, I was relieved, thinking maybe I'd catch up with another hiker who could confirm I was heading in the right direction. But when I stopped and called out, the footsteps stopped too. When I started walking again, they resumed, always staying just far enough behind me that I couldn't see who was making them. I tried stopping suddenly several more times, and each time the pattern was the same. The moment I paused, the footsteps behind me would cease. The second I started walking, they'd start up again, maintaining exactly the same distance. It was like being followed by my own echo, except the timing was just slightly off. After about 20 minutes of this game, I decided to step off the trail and hide behind a large oak tree to see who was following me. I waited there for almost 10 minutes, watching the path and listening for any sign of another person. Nothing. Complete silence again, except for the sound of my own breathing and heartbeat. When I stepped back onto the trail and continued walking, the footsteps resumed immediately. Same rhythm, same distance behind me. But I was certain that no one had passed my hiding spot. It was like whoever was making the sounds had simply materialized when I started walking again. That's when I really started to move. I wasn't quite running, but I was walking as fast as I could manage with a full pack, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was behind me. The footsteps matched my pace exactly, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. By 6 p.m., it was starting to get dark earlier than it should have, and I was becoming genuinely frightened. I should have reached the parking lot hours ago, but the trail seemed to stretch on indefinitely through identical forest. My water was running low, and I was getting tired from the fast pace I'd been maintaining. That's when I saw the first one. I'd stopped to catch my breath and take a drink, and when I looked up from my water bottle, there was a figure standing on the trail about 50 yards ahead of me. At first glance, it looked like a person, roughly human height and shape, wearing what might have been dark clothing, but something about the proportions was wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past where the knees should be. The way it stood was off too, like the joints bent in directions they shouldn't. And it was completely motionless, just standing there facing me like it had been waiting. I called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker who needed help, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all, not even to shift its weight or turn its head. I started walking toward it, slowly and carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on what I could see of its face in the gathering dusk. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't wearing clothes at all. What I'd taken for dark fabric was skin, but the wrong color and texture, grayish-brown like old leather, and too smooth. And the face, if you could call it a face, was just wrong in every possible way. The features were in approximately the right places, but the proportions were all off. Eyes too large and set too wide apart, no visible nose, just holes where nostrils should be. The mouth was a straight line across the lower part of what should have been the head, showing no teeth or tongue when it was closed. I stopped walking when I was about 20 feet away. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, trying to process what I was looking at. This thing that looked almost human, but was clearly something else entirely. Then it moved. The head tilted to one side, farther than any human neck could turn, until it was nearly horizontal. The mouth opened, revealing not teeth, but rows of what looked like small, sharp stones. And it made a sound, not quite a voice, but a dry, rustling noise like dead leaves being crushed. That broke the spell. I turned and ran back down the trail as fast as I could manage with the pack bouncing on my back. Behind me, I could hear that rustling sound again, but louder now and seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, crashing through the forest without any thought for following the trail. Branches whipped across my face and caught at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear movement in the trees around me. Lots of movement, like multiple large shapes paralleling my path through the woods. Eventually, I had to stop. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like rubber. I'd lost the trail completely and had no idea which direction I was heading. It was getting dark fast, and I needed to figure out where I was before I got completely turned around in the forest. I pulled out my flashlight and tried to get my bearings. The beam illuminated the trees immediately around me, but beyond that circle of light, everything was black. I couldn't see stars through the canopy, and I'd lost track of which direction I'd come from. That's when I heard my car alarm. It was faint but unmistakable. The chirping sound my Honda made when the alarm was triggered, and it was coming from somewhere off to my right, through the trees. I'd never been so happy to hear that annoying noise in my life. I crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, using my flashlight to avoid the worst obstacles. The alarm stopped after a few seconds, but I'd gotten a good bearing on the direction. I kept pushing through the forest, hoping I was heading toward the parking lot and not toward something else entirely. After maybe 10 more minutes of fighting through thick brush, I saw light ahead. Not the warm yellow glow of electric lights, but something paler and colder. Still, it was definitely artificial light, which meant I was getting close to civilization. I emerged from the tree line at the edge of the parking lot and immediately felt a wave of relief. There was my Honda, sitting exactly where I'd left it in Space 14, illuminated by the security lights mounted around the lot. Everything looked normal and safe and familiar. But as I walked across the gravel toward my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were other people in the parking lot, several figures moving around the vehicles, but moving wrong, just like the thing I'd encountered on the trail. They were gathered around my car, specifically, circling it like they were examining it. As I got closer, I could see that they were the same type of creatures I'd run from in the forest. Tall, wrong proportions, that same grayish-brown skin. There were at least 5 or 6 of them, maybe more in the shadows beyond the range of the security lights. One of them was pressed up against the driver's side window, leaving greasy smears on the glass as it moved its face back and forth. Another was crouched down by the front tire, running its 2 long fingers over the hubcap. A third had somehow gotten the passenger door open and was leaning inside, making that same rustling sound I'd heard on the trail. I backed up toward the tree line, hoping they hadn't noticed me yet, but as soon as I took a step backward, every single one of them turned to look in my direction. 6 pairs of those 2 large, 2 wide eyes reflecting the security lights like an animal's. They didn't rush toward me or make any aggressive moves. They just stood there, watching, waiting, like they'd been expecting me to show up. The one that had been inside my car straightened up and stepped away from the vehicle. In its hands, if you could call them hands, it was holding something. My driver's license. It held the plastic card up toward its face, then turned to look directly at the security camera mounted on the pole above the parking spaces. That's when I realized they weren't just random creatures wandering around the 2A mountains. They knew who I was. They'd been through my car, found my identification, and they were making sure I knew it. The creature holding my license dropped it on the ground and began walking toward me. Not fast, but with that same deliberate, wrong-jointed movement I'd seen on the trail. The others followed, spreading out to cut off potential escape routes. I ran. I crashed back into the forest without any plan except to get away from those things. I could hear them behind me, but they weren't making any effort to move quickly. It was like they knew something I didn't, like they were confident they could find me whenever they wanted to. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, then walked until walking became stumbling, then stumbled until I found myself sitting against a tree trunk, somewhere in complete darkness, gasping for breath and trying not to make any noise that might give away my location. I don't know how long I sat there. It might have been an hour, might have been all night. Time seemed to have stopped meaning anything. Eventually, though, the absolute black around me began to fade to gray, and I realized dawn was coming. As soon as there was enough light to see, I started moving again. I still didn't know exactly where I was, but I had a general sense of which direction the parking lot lay, and more importantly, I could navigate by the slowly brightening sky. It took me most of the morning to find my way back to the edge of the parking lot. When I finally crept out of the tree line, the sun was fully up, and everything looked completely normal again. My car was sitting in space 14, exactly where I'd left it. No signs of the creatures from the night before, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. I approached the Honda carefully, expecting to see damage or signs that it had been broken into. But everything appeared untouched. The doors were locked, the windows were intact, and when I clicked the key fob, the car chirped normally and unlocked. It wasn't until I got inside that I noticed what they'd done. My camping gear, the stuff that had been in the car when I'd left for the hike, was arranged in precise patterns on the hood and roof of the Honda. My road atlas was spread open and held down with carefully placed stones. My emergency kit was disassembled, with each component arranged in a perfect line across the windshield. Even the spare change for my cup holder had been stacked in neat towers on the dashboard. Everything was there, nothing was missing, but it had all been taken out, examined, and then put back according to some system I couldn't understand. Like someone had been taking inventory of my entire life. I threw all the gear into the back seat and got out of there as fast as the Honda would take me. I didn't stop until I was off the mountain completely, and I didn't really feel safe until I was back in Roanoke with familiar buildings and traffic and all the normal chaos of city life around me. The police weren't particularly interested in my story. A missing hiker who'd found his own way out and had no evidence of any crime wasn't exactly a high-priority case. The Park Service took a report, but seemed more concerned with whether I'd followed proper camping procedures than with whatever I thought I'd encountered in the woods. I never went back to Shenandoah. Hell, I've barely been hiking anywhere since then. Every time I think about planning a camping trip, I remember those things circling my car in the parking lot, and I find some excuse to stay home instead. The weird thing is, I kept having dreams about that security camera for months afterward. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams, where I was watching myself from the perspective of that camera mounted above the parking spaces, watching myself arrive, gear up, head out on the trail, and then watching those creatures emerge from the woods, examining my car, going through my belongings, like they were trying to understand what kind of person I was. I still work at Marco's, still drive the same beat-up Honda, but I don't take long trips by myself anymore. And I sure as hell don't go anywhere that doesn't have cell phone coverage. Some experiences change you, you know? They make you realize that there are things out there in the wilderness that we don't understand, things that are better left alone. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I'd stayed and tried to communicate with them somehow. But honestly, I'm glad I'll never know the answer to that question. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Lisa Chen, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago this November. I work data processing for a credit union in Richmond, Virginia. Nothing exciting, just spreadsheets and loan applications. The reason I'm sharing this now is because every year around this time, I get contacted by search and rescue teams, paranormal investigators, even documentary filmmakers asking about my sister Sarah's disappearance. They all want to hear the voicemail. Most of them think I'm lying. Some think I'm crazy. A few think I'm telling the truth, and those are the ones that scare me the most. Sarah was 2 years younger than me, 24 when this happened. She'd been working at Bamboo Cafe downtown, saving every tip dollar for outdoor gear. Our parents immigrated from Taiwan when I was 5, and they never understood Sarah's obsession with the mountains. To them, nature was something to survive, not explore for fun. But Sarah felt drawn to the wilderness in a way that seemed almost genetic, like she was answering some call the rest of us couldn't hear. She'd been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail since college, always solo, always prepared. Sarah wasn't reckless. She carried GPS devices, satellite communicators, more first aid supplies than most paramedics. She knew her limits and respected the mountains. That's why when she went missing on what should have been a routine day hike, nobody could understand it. The trail section she chose, that November 22nd, runs through some of the oldest mountains in Virginia, places where Cherokee and Monacan peoples hunted for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. Our grandfather used to tell stories about that area, not the romanticized folklore you read in books, but harder stories, older ones. He'd grown up in coal country further west, but his family had connections to those ancient ridges. Stories passed down through generations of mountain people who knew things weren't always what they seemed up there. Gramps had dozens of tales about the quiet folk, people who'd lived so far back in the hollows for so long that they'd evolved past the need for speech. He said they communicated through touch, through shared consciousness, and that speaking aloud in their territory was considered crude and offensive. Most of the family dismissed these as old mountain superstitions, but Sarah listened to every word with this intensity that made the rest of us uncomfortable. What made those stories particularly unsettling was how Gramps changed in his final year. He'd always been talkative, too talkative, according to our grandmother, but sometime after his 80th birthday, he began speaking less and less. By the end, he'd go weeks without saying a word, just sitting on his porch in perfect silence, listening to sounds the rest of us couldn't identify. When doctors examined him, they found nothing wrong. His throat, his brain, his hearing, all perfectly normal. He simply seemed to have lost interest in words. The last conversation I had with him, about a month before he died, still gives me chills. I'd asked him why he'd stopped talking so much, and he'd looked at me with these clear, alert eyes and whispered, "Sometimes the mountain calls you home, and when it does, you got to learn to listen without making noise. Words just get in the way of what's really being said." Sarah had spent that summer visiting Gramps' old property, hiking the trails around his cabin, claiming she felt closer to him there. She said the silence in those mountains was different, deeper, more complete than anywhere else she'd ever been. Looking back, I think she was already hearing whatever had called to him. November 22nd was a Thursday. Sarah had requested the day off work specifically for this hike. She'd been planning it for weeks, studying topographical maps, checking weather forecasts, even researching the area's history at the state library. She texted me at 5:47 a.m. with a photo of her gear laid out. Her red backpack, GPS unit, emergency beacon, enough supplies for 3 days even though she planned to be back by sunset. "Last big hike before winter sets in," she'd written. "Going to explore some of the old hunting trails Gramps mentioned. Wish me luck." I'd texted back telling her to be safe, to check in every few hours. She'd sent me her planned route, marked her expected turnaround times, even given me the contact information for the trail registry. Sarah was methodical about safety, which is why what happened next was so impossible to understand. She parked at the Rockfish Gap trailhead at 7:15 a.m. according to the parking receipt found in her car. The trail register showed her signature at 7:23 a.m., noting she planned to return by 6 p.m. 2 other hikers saw her around 9 a.m. near mile marker 12, where she stopped to photograph some unusual rock formations. She seemed normal, cheerful, excited about the day ahead. After that, nothing. No more sightings, no emergency beacon activation, no contact with anyone. When she didn't return by 8 p.m., her roommate called me, and I called Park Services. By midnight, they'd found her car, keys locked inside, everything else exactly as she'd left it. The search began at first light and continued for 18 days. They brought in teams from 3 states, K-9 units, helicopter crews, volunteers with decades of mountain rescue experience. What they found didn't make sense. Sarah's trail just stopped. About 4 miles in, near an area locals called Whispering Ridge, her footprints simply ended in the middle of the path. No signs of struggle, no evidence she'd left the trail voluntarily, no indication of where she could have gone. The search dogs behaved strangely in that area. Experienced tracking animals would approach within about 50 yards of where her trail ended, then refuse to go further. They'd whine, pull backward toward their handlers, some even lay down and wouldn't move. One dog handler told me he'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of rescue work. But the strangest part was the silence. Every search team mentioned it. The area around Whispering Ridge was completely devoid of sound, no birds, no insects, no wind rustling through leaves. Even human voices seemed muffled there, like the air itself was absorbing sound. Some volunteers refused to return after the first day, claiming the place felt wrong in a way they couldn't explain. On the third day of searching, I got a call from my phone carrier. They'd detected unusual activity on my account specifically, a voicemail that had been left at 2:17 a.m. on November 23rd but hadn't registered in their system until 48 hours later. The timestamp was impossible, they said. The call had been placed from Sarah's number, but her phone had been dead for over a day based on their tower data. I didn't want to listen to it. Something about the timing, the impossibility of its existence, filled me with dread I couldn't rationalize. But I had to know. The message started normally enough. Sarah's voice, tired but recognizable. "Hey Lisa, it's Sarah. I know it's late, but I had to call." But even in those first words, something was off. Her breathing was different, slower, deeper, like she was concentrating on remembering how to speak. And there was background noise I couldn't identify at first. A rhythmic tapping like fingernails against wood, but too regular, too deliberate to be natural. Something incredible happened today. I found them, Lisa. I found the quiet ones. My blood went cold. She was talking about Gramps' stories, those old tales about mountain people who'd given up speech. But Sarah was a biology major, rational and scientific. She didn't believe in folklore. Remember Grandpa's stories about the mountain people who gave up speaking? They're real, Lisa. They've been here longer than any human settlement, longer than the Cherokee, longer than the mountains themselves. Her voice was changing as she spoke, becoming softer, more distant. The tapping in the background had developed into a complex rhythm, and I realized there were other sounds breathing, but not quite human. Too slow, too synchronized, like multiple people breathing in perfect unison. They communicate through touch, through shared consciousness. No need for crude sounds like talking when minds can connect directly. This didn't sound like my sister at all. Sarah was articulate, precise in her speech, but now she was speaking in this dreamy, disconnected way, like she was reciting someone else's words. I understand now why Grandpa stopped speaking in his last year. He'd been chosen too. They were calling him home to the mountains, teaching him to listen to what's really being said. The breathing sounds in the background were getting louder, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps, but wrong too many feet, moving in perfect synchronization, like a dozen people walking as one entity. Sarah's voice was becoming harder to understand, more whispered. My throat feels different now. Words are getting harder to form, but thoughts are so much clearer. I can hear their collective consciousness, Lisa. I can hear the mountain itself thinking. She was talking about language corrupting pure thought, about how every spoken word weakened the ancient silence that the mountains required. None of this was Sarah. These weren't her ideas, her vocabulary, her way of thinking. They're showing me how much noise we make, how much damage our voices do. Every word is violence against the perfect quiet they've maintained for millennia. Then I heard something that still wakes me up at night, the sound of multiple hands clapping in perfect unison. Not applause, but slow, deliberate clapping, like a ritual, like approval. Clap, clap, clap. The rhythm, exactly, matched the tapping from earlier. Lisa, they want me to stay. They want me to become part of their quiet family. Her voice was barely audible now, and I had to turn my phone's volume to maximum. She was speaking like someone who was forgetting how to use their vocal cords. I can feel my voice fading. Soon, I won't need words at all. The silence is so beautiful, Lisa, deeper than any sound could ever be. The clapping stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, complete silence, but silence that felt alive, purposeful, like it was listening. Tell Mom and Dad I'm happy. Tell them I found where I belong. But don't come looking for me. The quiet ones only choose certain people, and you're not ready yet. Those last words, "You're not ready yet," they weren't spoken in Sarah's voice. The tone was different, older, like someone else was using her vocal cords. And the pronunciation was archaic, formal, like someone who had learned English as a second language centuries ago. I can hear the mountain's heartbeat when I stop talking. I can feel its dreams when I stop thinking in words. My voice is becoming part of there. The sentence never finished. Instead, I heard what sounded like the phone being carefully placed down, and then 30 seconds of the most complete silence I've ever experienced. Not just absence of sound, but silence that had weight and presence. Silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like deep water. The voicemail ended with a soft click. I played it for the search coordinator the next morning. Ranger Morrison listened with the kind of professional neutrality you'd expect, but I watched his face change as the message progressed. When it ended, he was quiet for a long time. "Ma'am," he finally said, "I've been working these mountains for 32 years, and I've heard things. Well, let's just say the mountains keep their own counsel. But I need you to understand something important. 3 times in my career, we've had people disappear in that exact area. Each time, family members received similar calls or messages. Each time, the missing person was never found." He pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers, 1,987, 1,994, and 2003. Young people, all experienced hikers, all vanished near Whispering Ridge. All left behind evidence they'd encountered something they called the silent people or the quiet folk. The files contained photocopies of journal entries, transcripts of garbled phone messages, even a few Polaroid photographs showing perfectly normal forest scenes that somehow felt wrong when you looked at them too long. "The thing is," Morrison continued, "local Cherokee elders have stories about that area going back generations. They called it the place where words go to die. Their people avoided it, considered it sacred but dangerous. They said there were things living in those mountains that existed before language itself, and speaking in their presence was like screaming in a library." I asked him why this information wasn't public, why families weren't warned. His answer still haunts me. "Because we tried that once, in 1994, posted warnings, put up signs. Know what happened? More people went missing. Turns out some folks hear a warning like that and think it's an invitation. The official search was called off after 18 days. Sarah was declared missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accidental fall. The voicemail was noted in the report but dismissed as a possible hoax or technological malfunction. Case closed. But I couldn't let it go. I spent the next 6 months researching everything I could find about the area, about disappearances in the Appalachians, about pre-Columbian civilizations in Virginia. What I found in university archives, in old newspaper microfiches, in forgotten ethnographic studies, was a pattern stretching back centuries. Indigenous oral histories from multiple tribes mentioned the same phenomenon. Places in the ancient mountains where silence lived as a physical presence, where certain people would be called to join the quiet and never return. Early European settlers reported family members disappearing in specific areas, always leaving behind evidence they'd encountered, silent watchers or wordless ones. The most disturbing discovery came from a 1,920 seconds anthropological study conducted by Dr. Margaret Thornton of the University of Virginia. She'd spent 2 years documenting disappearances in the region and had identified what she called acoustic dead zones, areas where sound behaved abnormally, where people reported feeling watched by unseen intelligences. Dr. Thornton's final report, buried in university archives for nearly a century, contained a chilling conclusion. The evidence suggests the existence of a non-human intelligence that feeds on or is sustained by silence. These entities appear to recruit human subjects through a process that gradually strips away their capacity for verbal communication, eventually absorbing them into what can only be described as a collective consciousness based on the absence of sound. The study was never published. Dr. Thornton herself disappeared during her final research expedition to Whispering Ridge in 1922. I made one trip to the area myself, against everyone's advice. Parked at the same trailhead where Sarah had left her car, hiked 2 miles up the path she'd taken. I never made it to Whispering Ridge. About 1.5 miles in, the forest changed. The silence wasn't gradual, it was like walking through an invisible barrier into a world where sound had been surgically removed. My footsteps became muffled, my breathing seemed to echo strangely, and even my heartbeat sounded different, slower, and more deliberate. But the worst part was the feeling of being observed. Not by animals or other hikers, but by something vast and patient and impossibly old. Something that was evaluating me, measuring my worthiness for. Something I didn't want to understand. I found Sarah's water bottle about 50 yards off the main trail, placed upright next to a carefully arranged spiral of stones. The bottle was clean, polished, and when I picked it up, it was warm like someone had just been holding it. But more disturbing than finding it was what happened when I touched it. For just a moment, I heard voices. Not sounds, exactly, but the memory or echo of voices. Sarah's voice, but also others. Dozens of others, all speaking in perfect unison without words. They were saying my name, calling to me, inviting me to understand what Sarah had understood, to join the beautiful silence they had found. I dropped the bottle and ran. Didn't stop running until I reached my car. And I didn't stop shaking until I was 30 miles away from those mountains. The bottle is still there. I know because I hired a private investigator to check on it last year. He found it in exactly the same spot, still clean, still warm. He lasted 10 minutes in that area before his equipment started malfunctioning and he fled, claiming the silence was alive and hungry. That voicemail is still on my phone. I've changed carriers 3 times, upgraded to 4 different devices, but somehow it transfers along with my other data. The file properties show it's growing larger over time, the audio quality becoming clearer, more detailed. Sometimes I can hear new voices in the background, whispered conversations in languages that might not be human. Last month, I received a call from a family in West Virginia. Their son had disappeared while hiking, and they'd gotten a voicemail that started with the exact same words Sarah had used. I found them, the quiet ones. They wanted to know if I'd heard anything similar. I told them I couldn't help them, but that was a lie. I could have played Sarah's message. Could have shown them the duffer investigation files, could have warned them about the pattern. Instead, I hung up and blocked their number. Because here's what I've learned in the 3 years since Sarah disappeared. The quiet ones don't just take people, they recruit them. And everyone who gets too close to the truth, everyone who listens too carefully to those messages, everyone who starts to understand what's really happening in those mountains, eventually, we all hear the call. Sometimes, late at night when my apartment gets too quiet, I can feel them listening, waiting, measuring my readiness to join their perfect silence. And the most terrifying part? Sometimes, I want to. The voicemail is playing right now as I type this. It's 2:17 a.m., exactly 3 years to the minute since Sarah first called. But this time, there's a new voice in the background. It's mine. I'm 29 years old and work as a freelance video editor, which means I spend most of my time staring at screens in my cramped apartment in Richmond. By last November, I was burnt out from back-to-back projects and honestly just needed to get away from everything for a while. My uncle had always told me about this old family cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains that nobody used anymore, so I figured it was the perfect time to finally check it out. He'd inherited it from my great-grandfather but never really went up there himself, said it was too isolated and the drive was a pain. That isolation sounded exactly like what I needed. The cabin was about 3 hours west of Richmond, tucked back in the woods near a section of the Appalachian Trail that doesn't get much foot traffic. Uncle Dave had given me the key and some basic directions, but warned me the GPS would probably cut out once I got close. He wasn't wrong about that. The last mile was all dirt roads and guesswork, following his hand-drawn map that looked like it was from the 1990 seconds. When I finally found the place, it was smaller than I'd expected, but in decent shape, just a one-room log cabin with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a loft for sleeping. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Perfect. I'd planned to stay for about 2 weeks, long enough to clear my head and maybe get some writing done. I'd been thinking about starting a podcast or YouTube channel, something creative that wasn't just editing other people's content all day. The cabin had an old wood-burning stove, a generator for basic electricity, and a well that still worked. Uncle Dave had stocked it with some canned goods and basic supplies over the years, though most of it was pretty dusty. The whole place had that musty smell of a building that's been closed up too long, but it was clean enough. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my time reading, taking long walks on the nearby trails, and just enjoying the quiet. There's something about mountain silence that you can't get anywhere else. It's not just the absence of city noise. It's like the whole world is holding its breath. I'd brought my camera and was taking photos of the fall colors, thinking I might use them for some kind of nature documentary project later. The nearest neighbor was supposedly about 2 miles away, though I never saw any signs of them. The area had some history to it that Uncle Dave had mentioned. There used to be a small community up there in the early 1900s, families who made their living logging and farming. Most of them moved out during the Depression, and the Forest Service eventually bought up a lot of the land. You could still find foundations and old stone walls if you knew where to look. I'd discovered a few on my walks, just scattered piles of rocks and maybe a chimney, slowly being reclaimed by the woods. There was something peaceful about it, seeing how nature eventually takes everything back. By my 4th day there, I'd settled into a routine. I'd get up around sunrise, make coffee on the old camp stove, and spend the morning walking or reading on the small porch. Afternoons, I'd work on some writing or photo editing on my laptop. The generator could keep it charged for a few hours at a time. Evenings were for cooking dinner and sitting by the fire, maybe listening to an old battery-powered radio I'd found in one of the cabinets. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in years. That's when things started getting weird. It began with small stuff that I initially wrote off as just being unused to country life. I'd hear branches snapping in the woods at night, but figured it was just deer or maybe a bear. The radio would sometimes pick up strange interference, voices that sounded like they were speaking backwards or in a language I couldn't identify. Old radios do that sometimes, especially in the mountains where signals bounce around weird. I'd just tune to a different station and forget about it. The first thing that really bothered me was on my 5th morning there. I'd left my camera on the porch table the night before, something I'd been doing every day without thinking about it. When I went outside with my coffee, the camera was gone. I searched everywhere, under the table, around the porch, thinking maybe it had fallen or an animal had knocked it off. Nothing. Then I found it sitting on the stone wall that bordered what used to be the old garden, about 50 feet away from the cabin. That didn't make sense. The camera was heavy, a professional DSLR that would have taken some effort to move, and it was sitting upright on the wall, positioned like someone had carefully placed it there. All the photos were still on it, nothing seemed damaged or missing. I told myself maybe I'd put it there myself and forgotten, but I knew that wasn't true. I always left it in the same spot on the porch table. The next day, I found my hiking boots moved. I'd left them by the front door like always, but in the morning they were lined up neatly at the edge of the porch, facing away from the cabin toward the woods. Again, perfectly placed, like someone had arranged them deliberately. This time, I was sure I hadn't moved them. I started bringing everything inside at night after that, but things kept happening. My coffee mug would be moved from the kitchen counter to the windowsill. A book I'd been reading would show up on the porch steps. Small things, never anything valuable or dangerous, but always moved to specific spots, like someone was organizing them according to rules I didn't understand. And they were always placed carefully, never dropped or thrown. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, trying to catch whoever was doing this. The thing was, I never saw or heard anyone approaching the cabin. The old floorboards on the porch creaked loudly whenever I walked on them, and the gravel driveway would crunch under any vehicle. Plus, I was a light sleeper. City living will do that to you. If someone was coming up to the cabin at night, I should have heard them. On my 8th day, I decided to test something. Before going to bed, I arranged several objects in very specific positions. My phone on the kitchen counter exactly centered between 2 canned goods, my flashlight perpendicular to the edge of the porch table, and my car keys hanging on a specific nail by the door. I even took photos of everything with my phone to make sure I'd remember the exact positions. In the morning, everything had been moved, but not randomly. Each item was repositioned in what looked like a deliberate pattern. My phone was now centered on the windowsill, exactly between two other objects. The flashlight was placed perpendicular to the edge of the stone wall outside. The car keys were hanging on a different nail, but still hanging neatly. Someone or something was taking my arrangement and creating their own version of it, like they were correcting my work. That's when I started getting really uncomfortable. This wasn't random mischief or animals. This was intelligent behavior. Someone was watching me closely enough to know my routines and possessions, and they had their own ideas about how things should be organized. The thought of being observed that closely without knowing it made my skin crawl. I tried staying awake that night to catch them in the act, sitting in the dark by the window with my flashlight ready. But around 3 a.m., I must have dozed off in the chair. When I woke up just after dawn, my laptop had been moved from the table to the porch, positioned so the screen was facing the woods. It was still running, still had battery, like someone had carried it outside very carefully. That morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any signs of whoever was doing this. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything that might tell me how they were getting so close without me hearing. What I found was worse than footprints. I found arrangements. Someone had been organizing things throughout the woods around the cabin. Fallen branches were stacked in neat piles. Stones were arranged in perfect circles. Dead leaves were gathered into geometric patterns. And these arrangements extended in all directions from the cabin, like someone had been treating the entire area as their project. Some of the patterns looked fresh, but others were partially overgrown, suggesting this had been going on for a while, maybe long before I'd arrived. The really unsettling part was how precise everything was. The stone circles weren't just rough approximations. They were perfect, like someone had used a compass and measuring tools. The branch piles were sorted by size and type. Even the leaf patterns followed mathematical principles, spirals and fractals that would have taken hours to create. This wasn't the work of some local prankster. This was obsessive, compulsive behavior on a massive scale. I started thinking about Uncle Dave's warnings about the place being too isolated. Had he experienced this too? Was that the real reason nobody in the family used the cabin? I wished I had cell service so I could call him, but the nearest tower was probably 20 miles away. That afternoon, I made a decision that I still think was the right one. Even knowing how it turned out, I was going to confront whoever was doing this. I set up my camera on a tripod, pointed at the porch, and started it recording, then positioned myself in a chair where I could watch the woods. If someone was going to move my stuff again, I was going to get them on film and figure out who they were and what they wanted. Around sunset, I heard the first sounds. Not footsteps, but something like breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from multiple directions around the cabin. The sound moved through the trees in a pattern, circling the building gradually. I kept my eyes on the woods and my hand on the flashlight, but I couldn't see anything moving out there. The breathing sounds continued for about an hour, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always that same slow, measured rhythm. Then, around 9 p.m., I saw the shadows. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moon was bright enough that night to cast clear shadows from the trees, and I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision. But when I'd look directly, there was nothing there, just shadows behaving the way shadows should, dark shapes on the ground following the moonlight. But gradually, I realized the shadows were moving independently of their sources. A tree shadow would shift position, while the tree itself stayed perfectly still. The shadow of the porch railing would change angle without the moon moving. And most disturbing, I started seeing human-shaped shadows moving between the trees, even though there were no people casting them. The shadows seemed to be working. They moved with purpose, gathering things, arranging objects, creating those same geometric patterns I'd been finding in the woods. I watched a shadow that looked exactly like a person kneeling down and carefully placing stones in a circle. But when I shined my flashlight in that direction, there was nobody there. Just the stones, appearing one by one in a perfect pattern. I sat there for 3 hours, watching shadows build things without bodies, organize objects without hands, create those obsessive arrangements that had been appearing around the cabin. The camera kept recording everything, though I wasn't sure how much of this would actually show up on film. Around midnight, one of the shadows approached the porch. It was definitely human-shaped, about average height, moving with normal human movement patterns. But it was just a a dark human outline with no person casting it. The shadow climbed the porch steps, its feet making the siestas. Boards creak exactly like footsteps would, and approached the table where I'd left several objects for my nightly test. I watched this shadow pick up my phone. I could see the object moving through the air, lifted by invisible hands, and carry it to the exact center of the porch. Then it went back for my flashlight, positioning it perpendicular to the porch edge, with the same precise placement I'd been finding every morning. The shadow was reorganizing my belongings according to its own system, right in front of me. That's when I realized what I was dealing with wasn't human at all. These were the shadows of people who used to live here, still going through their daily routines decades after their bodies were gone. The old community Uncle Dave had told me about, the families who'd lived and worked in these woods for generations, were still here in some form. Still organizing their homes, still maintaining their territories, still following the habits that had defined their lives. But they seemed to have included me in their community now. The constant rearrangement of my belongings wasn't harassment, it was housekeeping. They were trying to take care of me the same way they'd taken care of each other when they were alive. The geometric patterns throughout the woods were their way of maintaining the property, keeping everything neat and orderly just like they'd done for decades. The shadow finished arranging my belongings and turned toward me. I couldn't see any features, obviously, but somehow I knew it was looking at me directly. It raised what would have been its hand in a small wave, like a neighbor acknowledging another neighbor, then walked back down the porch steps and disappeared into the woods. I sat there until dawn, but didn't see any more activity. When the sun came up, my belongings were arranged exactly as I'd watched the shadow place them. The camera had recorded everything, though when I reviewed the footage later, you could only see the objects moving by themselves. The shadows didn't show up on the recording at all. That morning, I packed up my stuff and drove back to Richmond. I couldn't handle another night there, not because I felt threatened, but because I felt like I was intruding on something I didn't understand. These weren't malicious spirits or dangerous entities. They were just the ghosts of a community that had never really left home. But being included in their routines, having them care for me like I belonged there, was somehow more unsettling than being haunted would have been. I called Uncle Dave when I got back to civilization and asked him about the history of the place. He admitted that he'd had similar experiences the few times he'd stayed there over the years, though he'd never seen the shadows directly like I had. He said the family had always known there was something unusual about the property, but nobody talked about it much. The previous generations had just accepted it as part of the place's character. I've still got that footage on my laptop, and I've watched it probably 100 times trying to make sense of what I experienced. You can clearly see objects moving around with no visible cause, being placed in those same precise patterns I'd been finding. It's the kind of evidence that paranormal investigators would kill for, but I've never shown it to anyone. It feels too private somehow, like sharing home movies of someone else's family. I haven't been back to the cabin, and I probably never will. Not because I'm afraid of the shadows, but because I don't want to disturb their routines any more than I already have. They've got their system worked out, their way of maintaining their home and taking care of each other. They don't need someone from the outside world coming in and disrupting their peace. Sometimes, though, especially when I'm working late and my apartment feels too small and cluttered, I think about those perfectly arranged stone circles and the careful way everything was organized around that cabin. There's something appealing about a place where everything has its proper position and someone always makes sure it stays that way, even if that someone doesn't have a body anymore. I still edit videos for a living, still live in the same cramped apartment, but I've gotten a lot better about keeping my space organized. I arrange things more carefully now, put objects in deliberate positions rather than just dropping them wherever. Sometimes I wonder if the shadows would approve of how I keep house these days. I like to think they would. I'm 28 and work as a warehouse supervisor down in Charlotte. Been doing that job for about 3 years now, ever since I got out of the Army. The work's steady, pays decent, but honestly, it can wear you down after a while. Same routine every day, same concrete walls, same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. By November of last year, I was feeling pretty burnt out. My girlfriend Sarah had been on me about taking some time for myself, maybe getting back into hiking like I used to do before I enlisted. I'd grown up spending summers with my grandparents up in the mountains near Boone, and some of my best memories were hiking those trails with my grandfather. He passed away 2 years ago, and I guess part of me wanted to reconnect with that. Sarah suggested I take a long weekend, maybe drive up to the mountains solo, clear my head. She said I'd been getting cranky lately, which wasn't entirely wrong. So I put in for a Friday off, packed my old hiking gear, and decided to head up to Roan Mountain. It's about a 3-hour drive from Charlotte, and I figured a couple days camping and hiking would do me good. I remember loading up my pickup truck that Thursday night, my old Chevy that I'd bought used a few years back. It wasn't much to look at, bit of rust around the wheel wells, but it ran solid. Threw my sleeping bag, tent, camp stove, and a cooler full of food in the back. I'd done plenty of camping in the service, so I wasn't worried about roughing it for a few days. The plan was simple: drive up Friday morning, set up camp at the state park, and spend the weekend hiking the trails I remembered from when I was a kid. The drive up went smooth. Left Charlotte around 7 a.m., stopped for gas and coffee in Morganton, and made it to the Roan Mountain area by about 10:30. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-50 seconds, typical November mountain weather. I'd checked the forecast, and it was supposed to stay nice through the weekend. When I got to Impossibly, the state park though, all the camping spots were full. Apparently there was some kind of family reunion happening, and they'd booked up most of the sites. The ranger suggested I try some of the dispersed camping areas further up the mountain, said there were some good spots near the trailheads if I didn't mind being more isolated. That actually sounded better to me anyway. I wasn't looking to be around a bunch of people. The whole point was to get away from everything for a while. The ranger gave me directions to a trailhead about 6 miles up a gravel road, said it was a good starting point for several different hiking routes, and that people camped there pretty regularly. He mentioned there was even a security camera at the trailhead parking area, something about monitoring for illegal dumping or vandalism. Made me feel a bit better about leaving my truck there overnight. The gravel road was rougher than I expected, full of potholes and washouts from recent rains, but my truck handled it fine. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could see why the ranger had recommended it. Nice flat area for parking, clean pit toilet, even a little information kiosk with trail maps. And it was completely empty, just me and the mountains. There was the security camera the ranger had mentioned, mounted on a tall pole overlooking the parking area. I figured it was good to have, in case anything happened to my truck while I was out on the trails. I parked and got out to stretch my legs, taking in the view. The trailhead sat in a clearing surrounded by thick forest, mostly oak and maple trees that were just finishing their fall color change. The air smelled clean and crisp, with that particular mountain scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I could hear a small creek running somewhere nearby, and birds calling back and forth in the trees. It felt good to be away from the city, away from the constant noise and pressure of work. I decided to eat lunch before setting up camp, so I grabbed a sandwich from my cooler and sat on the tailgate of my truck, looking over the trail map. There were several different routes: a short nature loop, a moderate trail that led to a waterfall about 2 miles in, and a longer trail that climbed up to a ridge with views of the surrounding valleys. I was thinking I'd start with the moderate trail that afternoon, maybe do the longer hike the next day if I was feeling up to it. The sandwich was good, just turkey and cheese, but everything tastes better when you're outdoors. I remember feeling relaxed for the first time in months, like the weight of work and city life was already starting to lift off my shoulders. The sun was warm on my face, and I was looking forward to getting back on a trail for the first time in years. I'd forgotten how much I missed being in the mountains, how peaceful it could be when you got away from everything. After I finished eating, I shouldered my day pack and headed for the trailhead. According to my phone, it was about 3:20 inches the afternoon. Plenty of time to hike to the waterfall and back before it started getting dark. The trail started out easy, well-marked and fairly level, winding through the forest alongside what I assumed was the creek I'd heard earlier. The trees were thick enough to block most of the sunlight, creating that filtered, cathedral-like lighting you get in mature forests. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I first noticed something was off. It started with the birds. They'd been singing constantly when I was at the parking area, but now the forest was completely quiet. Not just quiet, but silent in a way that felt wrong. No bird calls, no insects, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the sound of the creek seemed muffled somehow. I stopped walking and stood still, listening, but there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the sound of my boots on the trail. Looking back now, I should have turned around right then. There's something about unnatural silence in the woods that every outdoorsman learns to recognize. It usually means predators are nearby, or something else that spooked all the wildlife. But at the time, I just figured maybe it was seasonal, or maybe I was making too much noise and had scared everything away. I kept walking. The temperature started dropping about 10 minutes later. I mean really dropping, fast enough that I could suddenly see my breath even though it had been warm just minutes before. The air felt thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm, but the sky was still clear above the trees. I zipped up my jacket and kept going, thinking maybe I'd just walked into a cold pocket of air or something. Mountains can have weird microclimates. But then I started noticing the trees. The leaves around me were changing color as I watched, not the gradual fall change you'd expect, but rapid browning and withering, like someone was fast-forwarding the seasons. Leaves were dropping constantly, creating this steady rustling sound that was somehow more unsettling than the earlier silence. I reached out to touch a maple branch, and the leaves crumbled in my hand like they'd been dead for months. That's when I decided to head back. Something was definitely wrong, even if I couldn't explain what. I turned around and started walking back toward the trailhead, moving faster than I probably should have on unfamiliar terrain. The weird thing was, the trail seemed different somehow. Longer. Like I'd been walking for an hour instead of 30 minutes. My phone showed 4:15, which didn't seem right. I could have sworn I'd only been on the trail for half an hour at most. When I finally made it back to the parking area, I felt confused and disoriented. I stood there for a minute, looking at my truck, trying to figure out what had just happened. The air was still cold. Cold enough that I could see my breath, but my truck's thermometer had shown 58 degrees when I'd parked. Now, it felt like it was in the 30 seconds. And the forest around the parking area looked different too. The trees were brown and brittle, like it was the middle of winter instead of November. I started unloading my camping gear, thinking maybe I'd just set up camp for the night and try to make sense of things in the morning. But as I was pulling my tent out of the truck bed, I found myself doing something I can't really explain. I started gathering rocks from the gravel parking area and building them into a pile. Not a random pile, a deliberate structure, like a cairn you'd see marking a trail, but bigger, more elaborate. I remember thinking it was strange while I was doing it, but I couldn't stop myself. It felt important somehow, like something I had to do. I kept adding rocks, making the pile about 3 feet tall, and then I started placing my personal items on top. First my wallet, then my truck keys, then my phone. It made no logical sense, but it felt right. Necessary, even. The cold was getting worse, but instead of putting on more clothes, I found myself stripping down. Took off my jacket, then my shirt, then everything else, until I was standing in the parking area in just my underwear. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was insane, that I was going to freeze to death, but I couldn't seem to control what I was doing. It was like being a passenger in my own body. That's when I started painting on my truck. I don't remember deciding to do it, or even thinking about it. I just found myself using my own blood. I must have cut my hand on something, because it was bleeding, to draw symbols on the side of my truck. Strange, angular symbols that I'd never seen before, but somehow knew how to make. My hands moved on their own, tracing out patterns that felt ancient and important. The symbols covered most of the driver's side of my truck by the time I was done. They looked like some kind of writing, but not any language I recognized. When I stepped back to look at them, though, I could somehow understand what they said. Hollow Walker Claims Offering. The words just appeared in my mind, like someone was speaking them directly into my thoughts. That's when I saw it. The thing that came out of the trees wasn't human, but it was trying to be. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with the basic shape of a person but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, bent at joints that weren't quite where human joints should be. When it moved, it flowed more than walked, like it was made of something heavier than flesh. The proportions were all off. Head too small, torso too narrow, arms that reached almost to the ground. But the worst part was how familiar it felt. When I saw it, I wasn't afraid. I was relieved, like seeing an old friend after a long absence. I walked toward it eagerly, my bare feet crunching on the frozen gravel. The thing opened what might have been arms, and I stepped into Den, its embrace without hesitation. Its touch was cold and soft, like mud, and it wrapped around me completely. The last thing I remember clearly is the sensation of sinking. Not falling, but sinking slowly into the ground like it had turned liquid. The thing held me close as we went down, and I felt grateful for its embrace. Everything went dark and warm and quiet. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital in Boone. The Rangers had found my truck on Monday morning when I didn't check out of the camping area like I was supposed to. My keys were inside, along with all my gear, but there was no sign of me. They'd organized a search party and found me Tuesday evening, about 5 miles from the trailhead, unconscious and suffering from severe hypothermia. I was naked except for my underwear, and I had frostbite on my hands and feet. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Monday night, and I'd been exposed to the elements for at least 48 hours. They couldn't explain how I'd ended up so far from my truck, or why I'd been found in a perfect circle of dead vegetation. The plants in about a 10-foot radius around where they found me were completely withered, like they'd been hit by a concentrated freeze. The Rangers showed me photos of my truck when I was recovering. The symbols I'd painted on the side were still there, dried blood spelling out words in a script nobody could identify. They asked me about it, but I couldn't remember anything after starting my hike Friday afternoon. The whole weekend was just a blank space in my memory. They figured I'd had some kind of mental breakdown, maybe brought on by stress or altitude or something. The official report listed it as an episode of acute psychosis with memory loss. I never told them what I actually remembered. The doctors and Rangers were good people doing their jobs, but how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you willingly walked into the arms of something that shouldn't exist, and that part of you wanted to stay with it forever? I sold my truck as soon as I got back to Charlotte. Couldn't stand looking at it, even after I'd scrubbed the symbols off the paint. Sarah and I broke up a few months later, not because of what happened in the mountains, but because I couldn't go back to being the person I was before. The experience changed something fundamental about how I see the world, and she could sense it, even though I never told her the details. I still work at the warehouse, but I've never gone camping again. Can't even drive through the mountains without feeling anxious. Sometimes I catch myself building small piles of objects on my desk at work, pens, paper clips, whatever's handy, and I have to consciously stop myself. The urge is always there, just under the surface, like muscle memory for something I never learned. To this day, I can't explain what happened to me up there. The rational part of my mind says it was hypothermia, hallucinations brought on by exposure and stress. But I know what I experienced, and I know it was real. Something lives in those mountains, something old and patient and hungry, and sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can still feel its embrace, and part of me misses it. I don't talk about this much. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them to. But if you're planning to go hiking in the mountains, especially alone, just be careful. Pay attention to the signs, the silence, the cold, the feeling that something's watching you. And if you ever find yourself doing things you can't explain, building cairns or painting symbols, or walking towards something that shouldn't exist, fight it. Run. Get away as fast as you can. Because once it has you, I'm not sure you ever really come back. I was 32 when I took that job with the Postal Service in Asheville. It wasn't glamorous work, but after bouncing between temp jobs for most of my 20s, having steady benefits and a pension felt like hitting the lottery. The route they gave me covered some of the more remote mountain addresses, places where GPS would just give up and shrug, and you had to know which unmarked dirt road actually led to someone's mailbox versus which one would have you backing down a mountain in reverse for 2 miles. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors anyway. Growing up in Charlotte, I felt suffocated by all that concrete and traffic. My weekends were spent driving up to the Blue Ridge Parkway or finding some trail that promised a decent view and a few hours away from civilization. When I moved to Asheville for the postal job, I figured I'd died and gone to heaven. Mountains in every direction, trails everywhere, and I was getting paid to drive around some of the most beautiful country in North Carolina. That's how I ended up adopting Ranger. He was this big German Shepherd mix that someone had surrendered to the animal shelter where my neighbor volunteered. The story was that his previous owner, an elderly guy who lived way up in the hollers, had passed away, and the family didn't want him. Ranger was already 6 years old, fully trained, and had this calm intelligence about him that made you feel safer just having him around. The shelter folks said he'd been trained for search and rescue work, though they weren't sure of all the details. I started taking Ranger on my hiking trips, and it was like having a professional guide with me. He seemed to know every trail in the area, would alert me to wildlife long before I'd see or hear anything, and had this sixth sense about weather changes. More importantly, as a woman hiking solo, having a 90-pound dog who looked like he meant business gave me the confidence to explore places I might not have ventured alone. The emergency radio was my one concession to my mother's constant worrying. She'd call me every time she saw a news story about someone getting lost in the mountains, and finally, to shut her up, I invested in a good handheld radio that could reach the Forestry Service frequencies. I'd check in when I reached trailheads, let them know my planned route and expected return time. Most of the dispatchers got to know my voice over the months. I was that responsible hiker who actually followed protocol. November 21st was one of those perfect hiking days you get sometimes in late fall. The leaves had mostly fallen, so you could see deeper into the woods, but it wasn't cold enough yet for that bitter mountain wind that cuts right through your gear. I'd planned a solo overnight trip to the mile 325 shelter on a section of the Appalachian Trail I'd been wanting to explore. It was a Tuesday, so I figured I'd have the place mostly to myself. The drive up was beautiful, that winding mountain road where every turn reveals another view that makes you want to pull over and just stare. I'd loaded up my small backpack with just the essentials: sleeping bag, some food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, headlamp, and the radio. Ranger rode in the passenger seat like he always did, occasionally sticking his head out the window, but mostly just watching the landscape roll by with that alert expression he got when he was working. I parked at the trailhead around 2 p.m. and checked in with Forestry Dispatch. The guy on the radio, I think his name was Mike, confirmed my route and told me to check in again when I reached the shelter. The forecast was clear, no weather concerns, and he said they hadn't had any wildlife incidents reported in that area recently. The hike up was exactly what I'd needed. Work had been stressful lately. Budget cuts meant longer routes and more pressure to make delivery times that didn't account for the reality of mountain roads. But out there, on the trail, with just the sound of our footsteps on the packed earth and the occasional bird call, I felt that familiar sense of peace settling over me. Ranger was in his element, ranging ahead on the trail but always circling back to check on me, investigating interesting smells, and generally being the perfect hiking companion. He'd found a stick somewhere that he carried for about a mile before finally abandoning it in favor of a more interesting rock formation that required thorough sniffing. We reached the shelter just as the sun was starting to set behind the ridge. It was a simple, three-sided wooden structure with a raised sleeping platform and a fire ring out front. Someone had left a small stack of dry wood, and there was evidence of recent use. Some charred logs in the fire ring, and a few pieces of trash that previous hikers had forgotten to pack out. I set up my sleeping bag on the platform and got a small fire going while there was still enough light to work safely. Ranger did his usual security patrol of the immediate area, marking a few trees and checking out the nearby stream where I'd planned to filter water in the morning. By the time I had dinner heated up, just a simple freeze-dried meal, full darkness had settled over the mountains. That's when I noticed the first thing that seemed off, though it took me a while to put my finger on exactly what it was. The mountains at night are never truly silent. There's always something moving around out there. Owls calling, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the wind moving through the trees. But as I sat by the fire eating my dinner, I realized it was quieter than it should have been. Ranger noticed it too. Instead of settling down by the fire like he usually did, he kept getting up and walking to the edge of our circle of light, staring out into the darkness with his ears pricked forward. Not the alert but relaxed posture he'd have if he'd spotted a deer or raccoon, but something more intense, more focused. Around 9 p.m., I tried to get a weather update on the radio, just to confirm that the clear skies were holding for tomorrow's hike-out. That's when I discovered that while I was getting a strong signal to the Forestry Dispatch, I couldn't pick up any of the usual radio traffic. No Park Service chatter, no emergency services, None of the background radio noise you typically hear when you scan through the frequencies in a populated area. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mountain terrain plays tricks with radio signals, and we were in a pretty remote location. I checked in with dispatch around 10 p.m. as planned, confirmed everything was fine, and banked the fire for the night. But Ranger wouldn't settle down. Every time I thought he'd finally relaxed, he'd lift his head and stare out into the woods, sometimes letting out these low, barely audible whines that I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't like him to be nervous. This was a dog who'd face down black bears without flinching. Around 11:30, I gave up trying to sleep and rebuilt the fire. That's when I heard the first sound that I couldn't explain away. It started as a low rumbling, almost like distant thunder, but it went on too long and had a mechanical quality to it, like machinery running somewhere deep in the woods. That's when I decided to call it in. I keyed the radio and reached dispatch immediately. "Forestry base, this is solo hiker requesting assistance." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Go ahead, hiker, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was clear and professional, probably Mike again. "My dog won't stop barking at something in the woods." As soon as I said it, I realized Ranger wasn't actually barking. He was making that whining sound, but it was more distressed than aggressive. "Is there wildlife present? Bear? Coyote?" "No, sir. Ranger's trained for wildlife. This is different." That was the truth. Ranger had encountered plenty of mountain wildlife, and he'd never acted like this. As I spoke, I watched Ranger back away from the tree line, his whole body tense, and that whimpering getting more urgent. He's backing away from tree line, whimpering like I've never heard. "Can you describe what you're seeing?" I looked out into the darkness beyond our fire and felt my stomach drop. The trees at the edge of our clearing were moving, not swaying like they would in wind. There was no wind, but bending inward, like something massive was pushing through them from the other side. Trees are bending, like something massive is pushing through. Even as I said it, I couldn't believe I was saying it. That's when Ranger's whimpering cut off mid-sound. Not like he'd stopped making noise, but like someone had hit a mute button. His mouth was still open, his body still in the same distressed posture, but no sound was coming out. Ranger just stopped barking, mid-bark. That's not normal. The silence for my dog was somehow more frightening than any sound he could have made. I was still staring at Ranger when I noticed my water bottle. I'd left it sitting on a flat rock near the fire ring, and it was floating about 6 inches above the rock's surface, just hanging there in the air, like gravity had taken a coffee break. "Something's wrong with gravity here. My water bottle is floating." "Ma'am, can you repeat that?" I looked around the campsite and felt reality take another step sideways. My backpack was hovering a foot off the ground. The sleeping bag on the platform had lifted off and was slowly rotating in the air. Small rocks and leaves were rising up from the forest floor, like someone had reversed gravity in a 20-foot circle around our camp. Gear floating around my campsite, rocks rising off ground. That's when the sound started. A deep, metallic groaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not from any specific direction. But like the air itself was being twisted into shapes it wasn't meant to hold. It was the sound of massive machinery operating under tremendous stress, but there was no machinery anywhere in these mountains. The air tastes like copper pennies and electricity. I could actually taste it, metallic and sharp on my tongue, and my hair was starting to stand up like I was touching a Van de Graaff generator. There's something moving between the floating rocks. At first, I thought it was just the shadows cast by the spinning debris, but then I realized it had its own substance. It wasn't walking or sliding. It was flowing like thick liquid that had decided to stand upright and move with purpose. Not walking, just flowing, like thick liquid standing upright. "Are you in immediate danger?" I watched this thing move around the edge of our campsite, and I got the distinct impression it was studying everything. The way my gear was arranged, the fire ring, the tenting, shelter. Like it was trying to figure out how humans organized their space and what all these objects were for. It's studying my camp, learning how humans arrange things. That's when I heard Ranger bark. Except Ranger's mouth wasn't moving. He was standing perfectly still, that unnatural silence continuing, but I could hear his bark coming from somewhere else in the woods. First from one direction, then another, like something was moving through the trees, making perfect copies of his voice. It's copying Ranger's bark perfectly, but Ranger's mouth isn't moving. I looked down at Ranger, and what I saw made my blood freeze. His eyes had gone completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire visible portion of his eyes was black as coal, and he was staring directly at me with an expression I'd never seen on any living thing. Wait. Ranger's eyes are black now, completely black. Emergency team is en route to your location. I tried to reach for the radio to down person, respond, but my hands weren't connected to my arms anymore. I could see them floating about 3 feet away from my body, still holding the radio, but I couldn't feel them or control them. My hands are floating away from my body. I can't control them. The radio slipped from my detached hands and fell to the ground with a clatter, and that's the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up 18 hours later in a hospital bed in Asheville, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The doctors said search and rescue had found me and Ranger in the shelter the next morning, both of us unresponsive but physically unharmed. I'd been staring straight ahead without blinking, and Ranger had been sitting perfectly still beside the dead fire, both of us completely catatonic. They kept me for 3 days running tests, blood work, brain scans, psychological evaluations. Everything came back normal. No signs of head injury, no drugs or toxins in my system, no explanation for why I'd lost nearly a full day of memory. The psychiatrist said it was probably severe psychological shock from some kind of wildlife encounter, combined with altitude and dehydration. But here's what bothers me. When they brought my gear back from the campsite, my water bottle was sitting exactly where I'd left it on the rock. My backpack was in perfect condition in the shelter. Everything was normal, exactly as it should have been, except for the radio. The emergency radio that had fallen from my floating hands was found at the bottom of the stream, 50 yards from the shelter. The stream that was only 6 inches deep and had been running clear when I'd scouted it for water the day before. I never went back to that section of trail. Hell, I barely hike at all anymore. I transferred to a different postal route that keeps me closer to town. And Ranger, well, Ranger's different now. He's still a good dog, still protective and loyal, but sometimes I catch him staring at me with an expression that makes me wonder if the thing that came back from that mountain is entirely the same dog I took up there. I still have the radio. The Forestry Service replaced it, but I kept the broken one. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that metallic groaning coming from its waterlogged speaker, and my hands start to tingle like they're remembering what it felt like to float away from my body. I don't talk about this much. Who would believe it? But every now and then, when the news reports another hiker going missing in that area, I think about calling the Forestry Service and telling them to check the radio frequencies. Because whatever I encountered up there, I don't think it's done learning about us. I'm 29 years old and work as a cashier at the Food Lion down in Richmond. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays the bills and gives me decent insurance. My sister Amy had just turned 27 that October, and she'd been going through a rough patch with her divorce. She kept saying she needed to get out of the city for a while, maybe do something outdoors like we used to when we were kids. Our dad used to take us hiking up in the Blue Ridge Mountains every summer, and Amy remembered loving those trips. So when her birthday rolled around, I suggested we spend the weekend up there, just the two of us, like old times. Amy worked at a dental office as a hygienist, and she'd been putting in crazy hours trying to keep herself distracted from all the lawyer meetings and paperwork. She looked exhausted when I picked her up that Friday evening. Her car was in the shop anyway, so it worked out that we'd take my Honda. We stopped at the outdoor gear store and grabbed some basic supplies, water bottles, energy bars, a decent first aid kit. Neither of us were serious hikers anymore, but we figured we'd stick to the marked trails and keep things simple. The plan was to drive up Friday night, find a decent motel somewhere near Shenandoah, then spend Saturday on one of the easier trails. Amy had found this loop trail online that was supposed to be about 4 miles, nothing too challenging. We weren't trying to prove anything to anybody, just wanted some fresh air and sister time away from all the stress back home. The weather forecast looked perfect for October hiking, maybe mid-60 seconds and partly cloudy. We ended up staying at this little place called Mountain View Inn, which was basically just a converted house with 6 rooms. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, was this sweet older lady who gave us homemade cookies when we checked in. She told us about the local trails and mentioned that the one we'd picked was real popular with families. said there were emergency call boxes every mile or so, which made us both feel better since our cell service was pretty spotty up there. Saturday morning started perfect. We had breakfast at the diner across from the motel, real mountain food with thick bacon and biscuits that could feed a small army. Amy seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months. We were laughing about stupid stuff, remembering the time Dad got us lost for 3 hours because he refused to ask for directions. The parking area for the trailhead was mostly empty when we got there, around 9. Just an older couple heading back to their car and a guy with his dog just starting out ahead of us. The trail itself was exactly what we'd hoped for. Well marked with those blue blazes painted on trees, wide enough that we could walk side by side most of the time. The leaves were just starting to change colors, and there was this crisp smell in the air that reminded me why I used to love being outdoors. Amy was taking pictures with her phone, whenever she could get a signal, saying she wanted to remember this trip. We made good time that first mile, talking about everything and nothing, just enjoying being away from our regular lives. That's when we came across the first emergency call box. It was this metal box mounted on a post, painted bright yellow so you couldn't miss it. There was a sign explaining that these phones connected directly to 911 dispatch and worked even when cell towers were down. Amy joked that it was like having a lifeline in case we ran into a bear or something. Neither of us thought we'd actually need it. The second mile got a little steeper, and we started hearing fewer sounds from other hikers. Actually, looking back now, I realize we'd stopped hearing much of anything. No birds singing, no squirrels rustling around in the leaves, just our footsteps and our conversation. Amy mentioned it first. She said something about how quiet it was getting, but in a peaceful way. We both figured it was, just because we were getting deeper into the woods, away from the parking area and road noise. Around the halfway point, Amy started complaining that her face felt weird. She kept touching her cheek and saying it felt warm, like she was getting a sunburn even though we were mostly in shade. I looked at her and didn't see anything unusual, maybe just a little flushed from the exercise. She said it felt tingly, almost like when your foot falls asleep, but on her face. I suggested she might be having an allergic reaction to something, maybe pollen or some plant we'd brushed against. We stopped at a little clearing to rest and drink some water. Amy kept touching her face and looking worried. She asked me to really look at her skin and tell her if I saw anything strange. Honestly, she looked fine to me. Maybe a little red, but nothing that seemed dangerous. I told her, if it got worse, we could always turn around and head back early. The emergency call box for mile 2 was right there, in the clearing. So I pointed it out and said if she really felt bad, we could call for help. That's when Amy said something that still gives me chills. She looked right at me and said her face didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore, like it was someone else's face that had been stuck onto her head. I tried to laugh it off, told her she was probably just dehydrated or maybe having anxiety from all the stress she'd been under. But she kept insisting that something was really wrong, that her skin felt like it was getting loose somehow. I convinced her to sit down and rest for a few more minutes. We shared one of those energy bars and finished a whole water bottle. Amy seemed to calm down a little, said maybe I was right about the dehydration. But she kept touching her face every few seconds, like she was checking to make sure it was still there. When we got up to keep hiking, she was walking a little behind me instead of beside me, like before. The third mile was when things got really strange. Amy started making these little whimpering noises, like she was in pain but trying not to worry me. When I turned around to check on her, she had both hands pressed to her cheeks, and she was looking at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Her eyes were wide and scared, but there was something else there too, something that didn't look quite like my sister. She told me her face was starting to feel wet, like it was melting. I could see she was sweating more than normal, but nothing that looked dangerous. I suggested we find some shade and maybe use the first aid kit to clean her face with some of the wet wipes we'd brought. But Amy started backing away from me when I reached for the kit. She said she could feel her skin moving around, shifting like it wasn't attached properly. That's when I noticed Amy had stopped sweating normally. Instead, there was this clear liquid running down her cheeks that didn't look quite right. It was thicker than sweat, and it was leaving these pale streaks on her skin. Amy started scratching at her face, saying she needed to get whatever was under there out. I tried to grab her hands to stop her, but she was surprisingly strong all of a sudden. The scratching got worse. Amy was digging her fingernails into her cheeks and forehead, leaving these red marks that started bleeding. She was saying things that didn't make sense, like she could feel something underneath her face trying to get out. I was getting really scared by then, thinking maybe she was having some kind of breakdown or medical emergency. I started looking around for the next emergency call box, which should have been coming up soon. Amy suddenly grabbed my arm and smiled at me. But it wasn't her normal smile. Her lips looked wrong somehow, like they were too loose or too wide. She told me she'd figured it out, that her real face was underneath, and all she had to do was peel away the fake one on top. Before I could stop her, she started pulling at the skin on her cheek with both hands. I watched my sister tear away a strip of her own face like it was a piece of tape. Underneath was this white, wet layer that looked like muscle or fat, but it was moving slightly, like it was breathing. Amy held up the piece of skin she'd pulled off and showed it to me, laughing like she'd just solved a puzzle. She said it didn't even hurt, that it felt amazing to finally get it off. That's when I ran for the emergency call box. I could hear Amy behind me, laughing and talking to herself about how pretty she was going to be once she got all the fake skin removed. The call box was about 50 yards ahead, and I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open the metal door to get to the phone. The 911 dispatcher answered on the second ring. I tried to explain what was happening, but how do you tell someone that your sister is pulling her own face off and seems happy about? I said Amy was hurt, that something was wrong with her face, but I couldn't make the words come out right. The dispatcher kept asking for more details, and I kept looking back at Amy, who was now sitting on a log casually removing more strips of skin from her forehead. Amy started walking toward me while I was on the phone. She was holding these wet pieces of her own face in her hands, and underneath where she'd torn the skin away was this white, glistening surface that moved and pulsed. She was talking in her normal voice, asking me to look at what she'd found under her face, saying how much better she felt now that the fake layer was gone. I told the dispatcher that Amy was pulling her skin away and that there was something white and wet underneath. The operator asked if she had severe burns, but I couldn't explain that this wasn't a burn, that Amy was doing this to herself and seemed completely calm about it. Amy got closer and reached out toward my face with her bloody fingers, saying I should try it too, that it felt incredible. The worst part was that Amy was still talking normally, like nothing unusual was happening. She was discussing how we should head back to the car soon, asking if I was getting hungry, mentioning that we needed to call Mom tomorrow for her birthday, all while holding pieces of her own face and reaching for mine with fingers covered in blood and that clear liquid. I dropped the phone when Amy touched my cheek. Her fingers were warm and wet, and wherever they touched, my skin started feeling tingly and numb. I could feel something happening to my face, like the sensation was spreading from where she'd touched me. Amy was smiling at me with exposed muscle where her lips used to be, telling me how pretty we were both going to be underneath. My legs stopped working properly. I couldn't run or even step away from Amy. Everything below my waist felt heavy and disconnected. Amy kept talking about how we were going to be so much better this way, how the fake faces had been holding us back our whole lives. I could feel my cheek getting warm where she'd touched it, and when I reached up to check, my skin felt loose and wet. I heard the dispatcher's voice coming from the phone on the ground, asking if we were still there, saying that emergency medical was on the way. But Amy and I were both changing by then, and I wasn't sure anymore if help would even matter. My face was starting to feel the way Amy's had described, like it didn't belong to me, like it was just a mask that was finally ready to come off. The last thing I remember clearly is Amy laughing and reaching for her own face again, saying we were going to be so beautiful underneath. Then everything got dark and quiet, and I don't remember anything else until I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. They told me hikers found us unconscious near mile marker 3. Both of us had severe facial trauma that the doctors couldn't explain, like our skin had been chemically burned or dissolved in some way, but there was no evidence of any chemical exposure. Amy didn't make it. She died from blood loss and shock before the ambulance could get to us. I never went back to those mountains. I moved away from Richmond 6 months later, and now I work at a hardware store in North Carolina. I still have scars on my face from whatever happened that day, and sometimes I can still feel that tingling sensation where Amy touched me. The doctors say it's just nerve damage, but I know better. I've never told anyone the complete story of what happened on that trail. The official report says we had some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by dehydration and stress. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Sometimes I still dream about Amy's voice on that phone call, asking me to look at what she'd found underneath her face. To this day, I can't listen to 911 recordings on the news or in TV shows. The sound of that dispatcher's voice just brings it all back. Amy's laugh, the feeling of my face going numb, and the terrible certainty that whatever we encountered out there is still waiting for the next hikers to come along.